Why did my joke at work get me fired? I made a joke during our Monday morning team meeting and my coworker Vanessa screamed. Not a little gasp or nervous laugh, but an actual horror movie scream that echoed through the entire 5th floor. She knocked over her coffee and ran out of the conference room so fast she left her phone and laptop behind. Everyone else just stared at me with their mouths open, and my manager Keith stood up slowly with this look on his face like I'd just confessed to murder. He told me to stay exactly where I was and not move or speak to anyone while he made a phone call. The other 12 people in the meeting gathered their things in complete silence and filed out without making eye contact with me. I sat there alone in that conference room for 20 minutes, watching the coffee from Vanessa's mug drip onto the carpet, trying to figure out what had just happened. The joke wasn't even that edgy, just something casual I'd said while we were discussing our quarterly sales targets. Everyone had been stressed about the numbers, so I'd tried to lighten the mood with a common phrase I'd heard 1,000 times before. Keith came back with 2 people I'd never seen before, both wearing dark suits and looking extremely serious. They introduced themselves as building security and asked me to follow them to an office on the 2nd floor. The walk through the building was humiliating because word had already spread and people were literally backing away from me in the hallways. Some were crying, others were on their phones, and I heard someone whisper, "I can't believe he actually said that," as I passed. When we got to the office, Keith told me to sit down and wait while he consulted with HR. I pulled out my phone to text my girlfriend about what was happening, but I had no service. The office was clearly designed to block signals, which made my heart start racing because why would they need a signal-blocking room for a normal HR issue? After another 30 minutes, Keith returned with our HR director Monica and a woman in a pantsuit who introduced herself as corporate legal counsel. They sat across from me at the table, and Monica pulled out a folder that already had my name on it. Monica asked me to repeat exactly what I'd said in the meeting, word for word, and I did. The 3 of them exchanged looks, and the lawyer started writing furiously in her notepad. Keith asked if I understood what I'd just said, and I told him honestly that I was completely confused about why everyone was reacting this way. It was just a phrase, something people say all the time when talking about taking action or making a decision. Monica's voice got very quiet and careful as she asked if I'd been present at work during the incident 3 years ago. I had no idea what incident she was talking about because I'd only been at this company for 18 months. Keith's face got even paler, and he asked Monica if that was possible, that I might actually not know. The lawyer said it didn't matter whether I knew or not, the company still had to follow protocol. Monica turned back to me and asked where I'd worked before joining this company. I told her I'd been at a startup in Austin that went bankrupt, then unemployed for 4 months before getting hired here. She wrote all of this down and asked if anyone had told me about the company's history or required me to complete any specific training when I was hired. I remembered doing the standard HR orientation and signing a bunch of forms, but nothing stood out as unusual. Keith muttered something about how the onboarding process had changed after the incident, and maybe people hired after that weren't given the same briefing. The lawyer interrupted and said none of this changed what needed to happen next. She explained that due to the severity of the situation and company policy, my employment was being terminated effective immediately. I started to argue that this was insane, that I hadn't done anything wrong, and that they couldn't fire me for saying a common phrase. Monica held up her hand and said I would understand soon enough, but right now, I needed to collect my belongings and leave the premises. When I asked if I could at least know what I supposedly did wrong, the lawyer said she couldn't discuss it while the situation was still developing. The vague answer made everything worse because now I was being fired for something nobody would explain. Security escorted me to my desk, where a cardboard box was already waiting. My coworkers had all been moved to a different section of the floor, leaving my area completely empty. I packed up my laptop, coffee mug, and the few personal items I kept at my desk while security watched my every move. They wouldn't even let me log into my computer to save personal files, saying IT had already locked my accounts. The elevator ride down was silent, except for the security guard's radio occasionally crackling with chatter. When we got to the lobby, he walked me all the way to my car and waited until I drove off the property. I sat in a parking lot 3 blocks away and tried to call my girlfriend Autumn, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried calling my best friend Lucas, same thing. I texted my brother asking if he was free to talk and the message showed delivered but no response. My phone buzzed with a notification from LinkedIn showing 7 connection requests had been withdrawn. I checked my profile and saw that 3 former coworkers had already removed their recommendations of me. Whatever was happening was spreading fast through my professional network. I drove home in a daze and found Autumn's car wasn't in our driveway, even though she should have been working from home that day. Inside our apartment, I noticed some of her things were missing from the bedroom. Her laptop was gone from the desk, her favorite jacket wasn't on the hook by the door, and the toothbrush she kept by the sink had been removed. I called her again, and this time she picked up. Her voice was cold when she asked what I wanted. I tried to explain that I'd been fired over some misunderstanding about something I'd said at work, but she cut me off. She said she'd already heard from 3 different people about what I'd done, and she couldn't believe I would say something so horrible. When I asked her to please tell me what everyone thought I'd done, she started crying and said she couldn't talk to me right now. She needed space to figure out if she could even be with someone capable of that kind of cruelty. The line went dead before I could respond. I tried calling back 5 times, but she'd blocked my number. My hands were shaking as I opened Twitter to see if anyone had posted about what happened at my company. Nothing came up in the search results, but that almost made it worse because it meant this was still contained within my immediate circle. My phone rang from an unknown number, and when I answered, a man's voice asked if this was me and confirmed my full name and address. He identified himself as Special Agent Faulkner with the FBI and said he needed to ask me some questions about an incident at my workplace today. My stomach dropped, and I asked why the FBI was involved in an HR issue. He said he couldn't discuss details over the phone, but I needed to come to their field office downtown within the next 2 hours. I asked if I needed a lawyer, and he said that was my right, but I wasn't under arrest or being charged with anything at this time. This was just an informational interview that was standard protocol for situations like mine. The phrase, situations like mine, echoed in my head because I still didn't understand what situation I was in. I told him I would be there, and he gave me the address and instructions for security screening at the building entrance. After we hung up, I sat on my couch and tried to piece together what could possibly connect a workplace joke to an FBI investigation. Nothing made sense, and the not knowing was worse than any punishment. I called my mom, and she answered, sounding upset. Before I could say anything, she asked how she was supposed to face her friends at church, knowing what her son had done. I tried to explain I hadn't done anything wrong, that I'd made a simple comment at work, and everyone was overreacting. My mom's voice got sharp, and she said Lucas had already called her explaining the whole situation. She wanted to know how I could be so callous, and whether she'd raised me to have such disregard for other people's suffering. I begged her to tell me what Lucas had said, because nobody would explain what was happening. She went silent for a long moment before asking if I was seriously claiming ignorance about the Riverside incident. The name meant nothing to me, and I told her I'd never heard of it. She made a sound of disbelief and said every person in our state knew about Riverside. It had been national news for weeks. My confusion must have sounded genuine because her tone shifted slightly from anger to concern. She asked when I'd moved back to this state from Texas, and I told her it had been 18 months ago. She calculated something and then said very carefully that the Riverside incident had happened 2 months before I'd moved back. My mom explained in halting sentences that there had been a workplace shooting at a tech company called Riverside Solutions about 3 years ago. 7 people had been killed by a former employee who'd been fired for poor performance. The shooter had left behind emails and social media posts that were analyzed by the FBI, and apparently they'd identified certain phrases and language patterns as warning signs. She said companies were required to report anyone using those specific phrases to federal authorities as a precaution. My chest got tight as I realized my workplace joke must have somehow matched one of those flagged phrases. I asked my mom what the phrase was, and she said she couldn't remember the exact wording, but it was something casual that the shooter had used repeatedly before the attack. She said the FBI had published a whole guide for HR departments about recognizing warning signs in employee communication. I thanked her and said I had to go because I needed to get to the FBI office. She told me she loved me, but needed time to process everything, and we'd talk later after she knew more about what was going on. I drove downtown to the federal building and went through 3 different security checkpoints before being directed to the 4th floor. Special Agent Faulkner met me in the lobby and led me to a small interview room with a table and 4 chairs. He was joined by another agent who introduced herself as Special Agent Patel. They both had folders with my name on them, which meant they'd been building a file on me. Faulkner started by explaining that I wasn't in trouble, but they needed to understand the context of what I'd said at work that morning. He asked me to repeat the exact words I'd used, and I did, still confused about what was wrong with the phrase. Patel pulled out a document and slid it across the table to me. It was titled, Red Flag Communication Patterns, Riverside Solutions Case Study, and was marked as internal FBI guidance for corporate security. She pointed to a highlighted section that listed several phrases that should trigger immediate reporting to authorities. Right there on the list was the exact phrase I'd said in the meeting. My hands started shaking as I read the document explaining that this specific phrase had been used by the Riverside shooter in 14 separate communications before the attack. The FBI had determined it was his way of signaling intent without being obvious, and they'd asked all major employers in the region to flag any use of this phrase immediately. Faulkner said my company had done exactly what they were supposed to do by reporting me within 30 minutes of the incident. I tried to explain that I'd had no idea about any of this, that I'd been living in Texas when the shooting happened and had never heard of Riverside Solutions. Patel asked me to provide proof of where I'd been living 3 years ago, so I pulled up old lease documents and utility bills on my phone showing my Austin address. She photographed them with her phone and said they'd verify the information. Faulkner asked why I'd used that specific phrase, and I said it was just something people say, a common expression about taking action or making a decision. He nodded and said that was exactly why the shooter had used it, because it sounded innocent to anyone who didn't know the context. The agents asked me questions for another hour about my employment history, political views, social media activity, and whether I had any connection to the shooter or anyone at Riverside Solutions. I answered everything honestly and showed them my social media accounts to prove I had no extremist content or concerning posts. Patel finally closed her folder and said they believed I'd genuinely been unaware of the phrase's significance. However, she explained that my former employer was still within their rights to terminate me because having an employee use that phrase, even innocently, created an unsafe environment for the survivors and families affected by Riverside. Faulkner added that my name would be added to a watch list as a precaution, which meant I'd face extra screening at airports and my background checks would be flagged for the next 5 years. I asked if there was any way to avoid being on a watch list when I hadn't actually done anything wrong. Patel said the system wasn't designed for nuance, and once someone was reported for using a red flag phrase, the protocol was automatic, regardless of intent. I left the FBI building feeling like my life had been destroyed by something completely beyond my control. The phrase I'd used was so common that thousands of people probably said it every day without knowing its dark history. But because I'd said it in a workplace connected to the Riverside incident's aftermath, I'd triggered an entire security protocol. I drove to Lucas's apartment and banged on his door until he opened it. His face was wary when he saw me, and he asked what I wanted. I demanded to know what he'd told my mom and why everyone was treating me like a criminal. Lucas let me in reluctantly and explained that one of his friends worked at my company and had texted him immediately after the meeting. The friend said I'd quoted the Riverside shooter, and everyone was terrified I might be planning something similar. Lucas had panicked and called our mom to warn her in case I showed up at her house acting unstable. I told him about the FBI interview and how I'd proven I didn't even know about the shooting. His expression softened slightly, and he admitted he'd been scared when he first heard, but was starting to believe I'd made an innocent mistake. Lucas showed me his phone where our family group chat had been discussing me for hours. My dad had suggested maybe I needed psychiatric evaluation because making that kind of joke showed poor judgment, even if I didn't know the history. My aunt said I should issue a public apology to anyone affected by Riverside. My younger sister had defended me, saying I wouldn't hurt anyone on purpose. Reading through the messages made me realize how quickly my own family had been willing to assume the worst about me. Lucas said that's what happened when something touched on collective trauma. People reacted emotionally rather than rationally. He promised to tell the family about my FBI interview, and hopefully that would help them understand I was just ignorant, not malicious. I asked him what I was supposed to do now that I was unemployed with a ruined reputation and on an FBI watch list. He suggested I might need to move to a different state where the Riverside incident wasn't as well known and start over somewhere fresh. The idea of fleeing my home state because of one sentence I'd said felt absurd, but also like the only realistic option. That night, I tried to research the Riverside shooting to understand what I'd walked into. The articles were horrifying to read because the shooter had killed people I would have recognized if I'd been living here at the time. The company was only 15 miles from my current apartment, and several victims had been community leaders whose names appeared on buildings and scholarships. The shooter's manifesto had been published by police as a warning, and I found it online. Reading through his writing, I saw the phrase I'd used appeared over and over in different contexts. He'd used it to talk about his plan, to encourage himself, to signal to online followers who were later investigated. The FBI had been right that it was his signature phrase, and seeing it repeated dozens of times in such a dark context made me feel sick. I understood now why Vanessa had screamed when I said it. She'd probably lost someone in the shooting or knew survivors personally. Everyone at my company had lived through the aftermath of that trauma, and then heard me casually use the shooter's catchphrase like it meant nothing. I spent the next 3 days in my apartment barely eating while my phone blew up with messages from people I barely knew. Former college classmates reached out asking if I was okay, or if the rumors about me were true. My landlord called saying other tenants had complained about having someone on an FBI watch list in the building. My car insurance sent a notice about elevated premiums due to a change in my risk profile, which I later learned was because being on a federal watch list affected insurance algorithms. Autumn finally answered one of my calls and agreed to meet me at a coffee shop to talk. She looked exhausted when she arrived and said she hadn't been sleeping since leaving. I apologized for everything and showed her the FBI documents on my phone proving I hadn't known about the phrase's meaning. She read through them carefully, and her shoulders relaxed slightly. She admitted she'd wanted to believe I was innocent, but everyone had been so certain I'd done it deliberately that she'd started doubting herself. Autumn said she needed more time to think about our relationship, but at least now she knew I wasn't dangerous. A week after being fired, I got a call from a journalist who'd heard about my case and wanted to write an article about the dangers of zero-tolerance policies and context-blind enforcement. I initially declined, but he kept pushing, saying my story illustrated important problems with how we handle security threats versus innocent mistakes. I finally agreed to speak with him on the condition that he verified every fact before publication. The resulting article was published in a major newspaper with the headline, "When Common Phrases Become Career Killers, The Hidden Cost of Security Culture." It detailed my situation, while also explaining the Riverside shooting's impact on regional employers. The article generated thousands of comments arguing both sides, with some people saying I should have educated myself about local history before making jokes at work, while others argued that expecting employees to memorize lists of forbidden phrases was unreasonable. Several employment lawyers commented that my termination was likely legal, but ethically questionable, given my documented ignorance. The article's publication had unexpected consequences, as 3 other people contacted the journalist with similar stories. A teacher had been suspended for using a phrase that connected to a school shooting she'd never heard of because she'd just moved from another state. A retail worker had been fired for a comment that matched something a serial killer had said, though she'd been quoting a TV show. A government contractor lost his security clearance for using a phrase flagged in a terrorism case, even though he'd learned the phrase from his grandfather years before it became associated with extremism. The journalist wrote a follow-up piece about how the expanding list of forbidden phrases was creating a minefield for workers who couldn't possibly keep track of every phrase that had been co-opted by violent actors. Some security experts defended the policies as necessary precautions, while civil liberties groups argued they were ineffective and destroyed innocent lives. I became an accidental spokesman for a debate I'd never wanted to be part of. 3 months after losing my job, I'd applied to 72 positions and received 72 rejections. Every background check flagged my FBI watchlist status, and every reference check revealed I'd been fired for using threatening language. No amount of explanation seemed to matter once HR departments saw those red flags in my record. I consulted with an employment attorney who said I could potentially sue my former employer for wrongful termination if I could prove they'd failed to properly onboard me regarding the company's security protocols. We reviewed my hiring paperwork and found that the mandatory training module about prohibited phrases had been added to the onboarding process 6 months after I'd been hired. Nobody had ever informed existing employees about the new requirement. The attorney said this might be grounds for a lawsuit, but warned that suing my former employer would make me even less employable and could take years to resolve. I decided to hold off on legal action while I figured out my next move. My brother got me a job interview with his company in Denver, which meant moving to a state where the Riverside shooting wasn't part of the local consciousness. The interview went well until they ran my background check and saw the FBI watchlist notation. The hiring manager called me in for a second conversation where he asked me directly if I was a security risk. I explained the entire situation and showed him the newspaper articles about my case. He said he believed me and wanted to hire me, but his corporate office had a blanket policy against employing anyone on federal watch lists regardless of circumstances. He apologized and said he'd try to get an exception approved, but couldn't make any promises. 2 weeks later, he called to say corporate had denied the exception. My brother felt terrible and offered to let me stay with him while I kept looking, but I could see the strain my situation was putting on his family. His wife was uncomfortable having me around their kids because she didn't fully understand the circumstances and worried about what her neighbors might think. 6 months after the incident, I'd burned through my savings and was working nights stocking shelves at a warehouse that didn't run background checks. The work was mindless and exhausting, but at least it was income. My co-workers knew nothing about my past, and I intended to keep it that way. Autumn and I had tried to make things work, but the stress of everything had broken us, and we'd officially split up 2 months ago. She'd moved back in with her parents and started dating someone new, which I'd learned from social media before blocking her accounts to save myself the pain of seeing her move on. My mom called once a week to check on me, but our conversations were strained because she still didn't fully understand why I couldn't just apologize and move on. The concept that I'd already apologized but nobody cared seemed beyond her comprehension. My dad had stopped calling entirely after I'd snapped at him during an argument about personal responsibility. Only Lucas remained fully supportive, regularly reminding me that I'd done nothing wrong, and eventually the dust would settle. 8 months later, there was a development that changed everything. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit published a new study examining the effectiveness of their phrase monitoring program. The data showed that of the 847 people who'd been reported for using flagged phrases over the past 3 years, only 2 had actually posed legitimate threats. The other 845 cases had been false positives like mine, where innocent people used common phrases without knowing their dark history. The study concluded that the program was creating enormous collateral damage for minimal security benefit. Several civil liberties organizations seized on the report and filed a class action lawsuit against the FBI, demanding the Watchlist program be dismantled. I was contacted by the lawyers handling the case and asked to be a named plaintiff representing the falsely accused. I agreed immediately because I had nothing left to lose and maybe something to gain if the lawsuit succeeded. The lawsuit attracted national media attention, and suddenly I was doing interviews explaining my situation to a broader audience. Some people remained convinced I must have known what I was saying and was playing innocent, but many others expressed outrage that our security apparatus had become so indiscriminate. My former company issued a statement defending their decision to fire me and saying they would do it again under the same circumstances. But the publicity also brought job opportunities from companies that believed in second chances or wanted to make a point about not letting fear dictate hiring decisions. I received 3 job offers, all from smaller companies that didn't have corporate policies against watchlist employees. I accepted a position at a tech startup in Portland that specifically recruited people who'd been wrongly caught up in overzealous security measures. My new boss had been fired from a previous job for accidentally triggering a similar protocol and understood exactly what I'd been through. A year and a half after making that joke in the conference room, my life had finally stabilized into something resembling normalcy. The class action lawsuit was still grinding through the courts, but the publicity had resulted in the FBI quietly reforming their watchlist criteria. I remained on the list, but new guidance had been issued to employers explaining that watchlist status should be evaluated in context rather than triggering automatic disqualification. My new job was going well, and I'd been promoted to team lead after proving myself over several months. I'd started dating someone new who knew my whole story before our first date and hadn't been scared off by it. The financial damage from my months of unemployment would take years to fully recover from, but at least I was moving forward rather than drowning. I'd learned to be extremely careful about workplace communication and made a habit of researching local history before making jokes anywhere new. The paranoia about accidentally triggering another security response never fully went away. Looking back on everything, the hardest part was accepting that I'd been punished so severely for genuine ignorance. I understood why the systems existed and why people were traumatized by the Riverside shooting. But the total lack of proportionality or willingness to consider context felt fundamentally unjust. A simple conversation when I was hired explaining the company's connection to Riverside and asking me to avoid certain phrases would have prevented everything. Instead, I'd been fired, investigated, watchlisted, and nearly destroyed financially because nobody had bothered to consider that a new employee from out of state might not know about a regional tragedy. The experience had taught me that intent matters far less than impact in our current cultural moment, and that sometimes there's no amount of explanation that will save you once you've accidentally crossed an invisible line. 2 years later, I still think about that morning meeting and wonder how different my life would be if I'd just stayed silent instead of trying to lighten the mood. But I also know that living in constant fear of saying something accidentally wrong is its own kind of prison. And at some point you have to accept that controlling every possible outcome isn't realistic. Sometimes you get unlucky and pay a price far exceeding any reasonable judgment of fault. All you can do is survive it and try to build something new on the other side. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.